On July 3, 1754, in a flooded ditch in the Allegheny Mountains, a 22-year-old colonel signed a document by candlelight. Outside the stockade, rain fell in sheets. Inside the fort, his men lay drunk on medicinal liquor, their muskets ruined by water. Nearly a third of his command already dead or wounded. He could not read French. The man translating for him could not read it well either. And when the quill touched the page, the young colonel confessed, in writing, to an assassination. His name was George Washington. It was the only surrender of his entire military career. And the document he signed that night helped to ignite, by the most widely cited modern estimates, a war that killed somewhere between 900,000 and 1,400,000 people across 4 continents over the next 9 years. Wars do not begin with armies. They begin with words. A summons misread, a diplomat mistranslated, a signature placed in the wrong place at the wrong time, by a man too tired and too young to know what he was signing. Most history books begin the story of World War with the 20th century. The first global conflict actually began in a Pennsylvania meadow almost 200 years earlier, with a 22-year-old in command, with a tomahawk in the dark, with a Dutch translator holding a candle to a sheet of paper neither of them could properly read. By the end of this video, you will understand 5 things that almost no one knows about this battle. First, how a 15-minute skirmish in a rocky ravine started a global war that reshaped 4 continents. Second, the word a Dutch translator could not properly render into English, and the legal trap it set for the British Empire. Third, the Iroquois chief who buried a tomahawk in a French diplomat's skull while speaking to him in his own language. Fourth, the small naval cannons hauled 600 miles into the wilderness that were never going to work, and the man who insisted on bringing them anyway. Fifth, why the British garrison was drunk and disorderly inside their own fort, while their commander was negotiating their surrender outside it. You will see how the man who would become the first president of the United States made a string of decisions so catastrophic that France gained the legal and diplomatic ammunition to declare open war on Britain. And you will see what happened to the 2 officers Washington handed over as hostages, one of whom would later help open the door to the conquest of Quebec, and one of whom would later wear a British uniform during the American Revolution. This battle was not about armies. It was about translation, about the gap between what a man meant to say and what the document said he meant. Hit subscribe before we begin. Let us step into the great meadows. To understand how a Pennsylvania meadow ignited a global war, we need to step back to the spring of 1753, when 2 empires looked at the same river and saw the same future. The Ohio River Valley, a vast, forested basin stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi. Fertile, navigable, rich in fur, and entirely contested. The British colonies sat along the Atlantic seaboard, hemmed in by mountains and outgrowing their own borders. Their population was exploding. Their land speculators were hungry. Their governors looked west and saw destiny. The French held New France in the north and Louisiana in the south. Between them stretched a thin, vital corridor of waterways and trading posts. They had fewer settlers than the British, but they had something the British did not. They had alliances, generations of patient diplomacy with indigenous nations who knew the forests as their grandfathers had known them. The strategic key was a single point on the map, the forks of the Ohio, the place where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers met to form the Ohio itself. Whoever held the forks held the highway into the continental interior. In the summer of 1753, the French moved. 2,600 soldiers marched south. They built forts at Lake Erie, They built forts at the headwaters of LeBoeuf Creek. They began constructing a flotilla designed to take the forks themselves. Virginia knew what this meant. Virginia's royal governor was a Scottish merchant named Robert Dinwiddie, and Dinwiddie was a major shareholder in the Ohio Company, a land speculation firm whose claims would be worthless if the French held the forks. He needed a messenger, someone young enough to make the journey through 600 miles of winter wilderness, someone gentlemanly enough to deliver a diplomatic warning, someone expendable enough that it would not matter if he did not come back. He chose a 21-year-old surveyor named George Washington. Washington was not yet famous. He was not yet a soldier. He was the second son of a moderately wealthy Virginia planter, a surveyor by trade, a militia major by recent appointment. He had never commanded men in battle. He had never traveled west of the Blue Ridge. What he had was ambition, 6 feet 2 inches of height, and a willingness to risk everything for a chance at distinction. In November of 1753, Washington rode west, through snow, through rivers running with ice, across the Allegheny on a hand-built raft that nearly killed him. He reached the French forts. He delivered Dinwiddie's letter demanding the French withdraw. The French commandant received him with civility. He fed him. He gave him supplies for the return journey. And he rejected the demand entirely. Washington came home with 2 pieces of information. The French would not leave, and the French were building boats to formally seize the forks of the Ohio in the spring. Dinwiddie read the report. He understood what it meant. He promoted Washington to lieutenant colonel of the Virginia Regiment. He gave him an order so blunt it has survived 3 centuries unsoftened. The order was to march back to the forks, to complete a British fort that small construction party had already begun there. And 2, in Dinwiddie's exact words, kill and destroy any French interlopers who tried to interfere. Washington was 22 years old. He had never led men in combat. He spoke no French. He had no maps of the country he was about to enter, and he was being sent to start a war. What he did not know yet was that the war had already started. In April of 1754, while Washington was still marching west, a French force of more than 1,000 men had descended on the forks. They had captured the small British construction party. They had begun building their own installation on the same ground. They named it Fort Duquesne, after the French governor of New France. By the time Washington learned this, he was already in the mountains. He had 293 men. He had a few wagons. He had 9 swivel guns, small naval cannons that should never have left the coast. And he had a problem. The fort he was supposed to defend already belonged to someone else. But Washington did not turn back. He kept marching. Because somewhere in those mountains, between him and the forks, there was an Iroquois leader waiting for him. A man who needed a war as badly as the British and French did. A man named Tanacharison. To understand what happened next, we have to understand the man who shaped it. Because Tanacharison was not a bystander. He was not a guide. He was the hand that moved every piece on the board. Tanacharison was a Seneca leader, born sometime around 1700, who had risen to a position of regional authority among the Ohio Iroquois. The British called him the Half-King. The title was a fiction the British invented to make their diplomacy easier. They needed someone to speak for all the nations of the Ohio Valley, so they pretended one man could. The French were not fooled. They considered Tanacharison, in their own words, more English than the English. They refused to recognize his authority. They refused to deal with him at all. This was the wound at the center of Tanacharison's strategy. He had been elevated by the British. He had been rejected by the French. His own people, the Iroquois Confederacy, were trying to remain neutral in the coming conflict. He had built his entire political position on being the indispensable broker between two empires. And both empires, in their different ways, were threatening to make him irrelevant. Tanacharison needed a war he could control, a war that would force every nation in the Ohio Valley to choose a side, and to choose his side specifically. A war that would make him, finally and permanently, the king the British had pretended he already was. So when Washington marched west in the spring of 1754, Tanacharison did not simply meet him. He guided him. He fed him intelligence. He told him where the French were. He told him what the French were doing. And on the night of May 27th, he told him a story that would change history. A French detachment, Tanacharison said, was hiding in a ravine, 5 miles away, off the main trail, concealed, not announcing themselves, not moving openly. Hiding. Washington heard the word hiding. He did not hear the word waiting. He did not consider that the French might be doing exactly what he was doing, sending a small advance party to feel out the enemy's position before committing to anything larger. He heard the word hiding, and his exhausted, ambitious 22-year-old mind reached the conclusion Tanacharison wanted him to reach. They were spies. They were scouts. They were the vanguard of an attack. The truth was more complicated, and we will never fully untangle it. But what we can say is this. Tanacharison knew the French detachment was small. Tanacharison knew it was led by a junior officer carrying a diplomatic summons. And Tanacharison knew that if he could get Washington to attack it, the war he needed would begin that night. He got Washington to attack it. The night of May 27th, 1754, was, by Washington's own description, black as pitch. Rain fell without pause. The forest was so dark that men marching in column lost sight of the man in front of them. Washington took 40 Virginians. Tanacharison brought 12 Mingo warriors. They left the Great Meadows camp at 10 o'clock at night. They had 5 miles to cover, on foot, in the dark, up a 700-foot ridge. 7 of the Virginians got lost on the climb. They simply could not see where they were going. They wandered off the path and rejoined their unit hours later. By the time the column reached the precipice above the French camp, only 33 Virginians were still with Washington, plus the 12 Mingos, 45 men. Below them, in a narrow, rocky depression sheltered from the wind, a French detachment was sleeping. Their commander was a 26-year-old ensign named Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. He had 35 men. He had set no sentries. He believed he was alone in the forest, deep in territory France considered her own, on a diplomatic errand that did not require him to expect violence. It was around 7 in the morning when Washington's force reached the ridge. The rain had eased. The light was gray. The French were beginning to move around their camp, building fires, preparing breakfast. Washington split his force. He took his Virginians to the front of the glen. He sent Tanacharison's warriors around to the back, sealing the rear exit. The trap was perfect. The French were surrounded before they knew they were in danger. A shot was fired. We do not know who fired first. The French said it was Washington. A document discovered in recent decades, containing the eyewitness account of an Ohio Iroquois chief warrior, also says it was Washington. Washington himself never identified the shooter. What we know is that within a heartbeat, the entire glen erupted. Musket fire crashed down from the ridge. Smoke filled the depression. The French scrambled for their weapons. Some fought back. Most ran. They ran toward the rear of the glen. And there, in the trees behind the camp, Tanacharison's warriors were waiting with tomahawks. The skirmish lasted 15 minutes. When it ended, 10 French soldiers were dead. 21 were prisoners. One had escaped somehow into the woods. He would carry the news back to Fort Duquesne. He would tell his commander what had happened. But the dead were not all killed in the volley. Jumonville himself, according to multiple accounts, including a sworn deposition from a British deserter, was wounded but alive when the firing stopped. He was on the ground. He was trying to speak. He was trying, in some accounts, to read aloud the formal diplomatic summons he had been sent to deliver, the document that would have legally framed the entire French operation as a peaceful diplomatic mission. He never finished reading it. Tanacharison walked through the smoke. He stood over the wounded French officer. He looked down. He spoke in French. "Tu n'es pas encore mort, mon père." "You are not yet dead, my father." And then he buried his tomahawk in Jumonville's skull. What followed is harder to write about and harder to verify in every detail, but the broad outline is clear. The Mingo warriors moved through the camp. They finished the wounded. They scalped the dead. They took 13 French scalps, possibly more, and they prepared to send them as gifts to neighboring nations. Physical proof that war had come, and that those nations now had to choose a side. Washington stood on the right flank of the engagement. He was exposed. Bullets had whistled past his head during the firing. He was unhurt. He was, by his own later admission in a letter to his younger brother, exhilarated. He wrote that he had heard the bullets and found something charming in the sound. He was 22 years old. He had just killed a man for the first time. He had just authorized, by his presence and his silence, the murder of a wounded diplomat. He had just handed the French Empire a casus belli that would echo across 4 continents. And he did not yet know what he had done. The French detachment had been carrying papers. Among those papers was Jumonville's summons, the formal diplomatic document ordering the British to withdraw from territory France claimed as her own. The summons was now in Washington's hands. It was clear, written, official. It proved beyond reasonable doubt that the French commander had been an envoy. Washington read it, or had it read to him. He must have understood in that moment something of the weight of what had happened. But he was 22. He was in the middle of the wilderness. He had a single surviving French witness loose in the woods and a hostile garrison 40 miles north. He did not have time to think about diplomacy. He had to think about survival. He marched the prisoners back to the Great Meadows. He wrote a report to Governor Dinwiddie describing the encounter as a victory over a French scouting party. He did not mention the tomahawk. He did not mention what Tanacharison had said. He buried those details in the silence that great men learn early to keep. And the Tanacharison sent the scalps north and west to every nation he could reach. The message attached to them was simple. The French are weak. The British have struck. Choose now. The war he had needed was finally his. There is one more thing about Jumonville Glen that history almost forgets. The French ensign Tanacharison killed was not alone in the world. He had a brother, an older brother, and that brother was a captain in the French Marines, currently garrisoned at Fort Duquesne. His name was Louis Coulon de Villiers. When the lone French survivor of Jumonville Glen reached Fort Duquesne, carrying the news of what had happened in that ravine, it was Coulon de Villiers who heard it. It was Coulon de Villiers who learned that his younger brother had been ambushed, wounded, and murdered with a tomahawk while attempting to read a diplomatic summons. And it was Coulon de Villiers who began, the next morning, to plan the operation that would corner Washington in the Great Meadows. This is the detail the textbooks miss. The French force that marched south to find Washington was not commanded by a stranger. It was commanded by the dead man's brother, the man who would, 6 weeks later, Write the surrender document Washington signed by candlelight was the brother of the man Washington had killed. 600 French regulars and Canadian militia, 100 indigenous warriors, all of them marching behind a captain who was not fighting for empire or for trade or for fur. He was fighting for vengeance. The battle Washington was about to fight was not the battle he thought he was fighting. It was a blood feud. And the man hunting him had a personal score that no diplomatic protocol was going to soften. Washington knew, as soon as the lone French survivor escaped the Glen, that he had bought himself a war he was not equipped to fight. Fort Duquesne held more than 1,000 men and a dozen cannons. He had 300. He needed to either retreat to friendly territory or fortify where he stood. He chose to fortify. The site he chose was the Great Meadows, a clearing in the forest, an alpine meadow surrounded by dense Appalachian woodland. It had water. It had open ground for defense. To Washington's eye, formed by European military theory and the open battlefields of textbook campaigns, it looked like the best position available. To Tanacharyson's eye, it looked like a death trap. The meadow sat in a topographical depression. It was the lowest point in the immediate landscape. Higher ground surrounded it on every side. The tree line, the edge of the dense forest, stood less than 100 yards from the center of the clearing. A trained European officer would have understood the danger. The standard smoothbore musket of the era was lethal at 100 yards. By placing his fort within musket range of cover, Washington was guaranteeing that any attacker could shoot at him from behind the trees, while he, in the open clearing, could shoot at nothing but trunks and shadows. He did not understand. He was 22. He had read about siege warfare. He had never seen it. Between May 30th and June 3rd, his men built the fort. It was a circular palisade, upright split logs, a central provision hut, a shallow trench dug into the wet meadow ground. Washington named it Fort Necessity, and the name was honest. It was built out of necessity, in haste, by men who knew they had no other option. Tanacharyson looked at it and laughed. He called it, in a phrase that survived him, that little thing upon the meadow. The half-king had calculated his moment. He had used Washington to start the war. He had no intention of dying in a hole in the ground for the Virginia Regiment. In late June, with his warriors and their families, Tanacharyson withdrew from the British camp. He took with him every indigenous scout, every warrior, and every piece of local intelligence Washington had depended on. When the French came, Washington would not see them coming. In mid-June, reinforcements arrived. Captain James Mackay with 100 British regulars of the South Carolina Independent Company. They were professional soldiers. They wore proper red coats. They drilled in proper formations. They were exactly the kind of troops a European commander would want in a fight. And they refused to take orders from Washington. The reason was a paper distinction that would poison British military operations in America for the next 20 years. Mackay held a royal commission issued by the king. Washington held a colonial commission issued by Virginia. In the rigid hierarchy of the British Army, no provincial officer could command a royal officer, regardless of rank. Mackay would not put his men under Washington's authority. He would camp separately. He would drill separately. He would, in his words, cooperate where it suited him. Washington wrote a furious letter to Dinwiddie about it. The letter did not arrive in time to help. By the end of June, Washington had perhaps 400 men. Half of them inexperienced Virginia militia. Half of them disciplined British regulars who would not fully recognize his command. He had 9 swivel guns, naval weapons designed to clear the decks of pirate ships at close range with a maximum effective reach of about 30 yards. He had built a fort in a hole. He had lost his indigenous allies, and the dead man's brother was 40 miles away and marching. On July 1st, Washington's exhausted column staggered back to Fort Necessity from a failed road-building expedition. The men had been trying to cut a wagon road through the forest toward the forks of the Ohio. Reports of the French advance had turned them back. They abandoned supplies on the trail. They abandoned wagons. They abandoned ammunition. They walked into the great meadows, starving, soaked, and demoralized. 2 days later, the French arrived. It was 11 in the morning on July 3rd, 1754, when the first French scouts emerged from the tree line at the northern edge of the great meadows. The day was overcast. A light rain had been falling since dawn. The air smelled of wet earth and cold wood smoke. The British pickets fired warning shots and ran for the fort. Washington formed up his men outside the stockade in the open clearing, behind the half-finished trench works they had been digging when the alarm came. He had drawn his line for a European battle. 2 ranks deep, muskets primed, officers in front. He intended to fight the French in the open field. Coulon de Villiers saw the formation and made a calculation his younger brother had never been allowed to make. He saw the woods. He saw the meadow. He saw the British standing in the open like targets at a fair. He gave the order that ended the battle before it properly began. He pulled his entire force back into the trees. 600 French regulars and Canadian militia, 100 indigenous warriors. They melted into the forest, spread out around the perimeter of the meadow, and took firing positions behind trunks, in undergrowth, on every angle of approach to the British position. Washington understood, in the moment he saw the French disappear, that he had lost the battle. If he stayed in the open, his men would be cut down by invisible enemies firing from cover. He had one chance, and it was the chance every European theorist would have endorsed. Charge the trees, dislodge the enemy with the bayonet, force them to fight in the open. He gave the order to advance. Mackay's regulars obeyed. They moved forward in disciplined formation, the South Carolina Independent Company holding its line, muskets at the ready, 2 swivel guns dragged forward beside them. They marched toward the tree line. Coulon de Villiers ordered his indigenous allies to charge. The Algonquin, Ottawa, and Huron warriors broke from the trees and ran toward the British line. They were screaming. They were firing as they ran. They were, by every account, terrifying. Mackay's regulars held. They fired a single-massed volley. The swivel guns roared. The charge faltered. A dozen warriors fell. And then the Virginia militia broke. The inexperienced colonial troops on Washington's flank simply collapsed. They had never seen indigenous warfare. They had never heard a war cry. They had never watched men in war paint charge them through the smoke. They turned. They ran. They abandoned the line and fled back into the fort. Washington's flank was open. Mackay's regulars, suddenly alone in the open meadow, had no choice but to follow. The entire British force retreated into the half-built stockade. Inside the fort, the trap closed. The French and their indigenous allies returned to the tree line. They spread out around the entire perimeter. They began firing into the fort from every direction at once. The British returned fire. Their volleys went too high. The muskets were aimed for European formations standing in the open. The enemy was concealed behind tree trunks, lying in undergrowth, firing from angles the British could not even see. British bullets clattered into the forest and hit nothing. French bullets came down into the fort and hit everything. The swivel guns were useless. Their effective range was 30 yards. The trees were 90. The cannons fired into the woods and accomplished nothing except telling the French where the British were aiming next. For 3 hours, the firefight continued. the French and their indigenous allies kept a steady, disciplined rate of fire from concealment. They did not waste ammunition. They did not expose themselves. They picked targets when targets presented themselves and fired only when the angle was good. The British, locked inside the stockade, fired at smoke and shadows. The casualties mounted slowly at first, then faster. A man would lift his head above the parapet to aim and lose it. A man would shift his position to reload and take a ball through the shoulder. The wounded crawled to the center of the fort. There was no proper surgery. There was a single regimental surgeon working under canvas, doing what he could with limited supplies. The wounded who survived the first hour did not necessarily survive the second. The men in the trenches outside the palisade were in the worst position. They had no overhead cover. They were exposed to fire from the higher ground in 3 directions. They were also exposed to whatever weather was about to come. They could not retreat to the fort without exposing themselves to even more fire on the run. They held where they were and tried to keep their heads down. Washington moved between the trenches and the fort. He was, by every account from men who survived the battle, calm. He was not a brilliant tactician in this engagement. He had no good options to choose between, but he was visibly composed. He spoke to his men. He repositioned what he could. He kept the surviving officers in communication. He behaved, in those hours, like a man twice his age. Around 2 in the afternoon, the rain returned. It did not return as the morning's gentle drizzle. It returned as a deluge, a summer storm rolling down off the Allegheny ridges, dumping water in sheets across the great meadows. The men inside the fort had nowhere to go. They crouched in their trenches. The trenches began to fill. The fort sat in the lowest point of the meadow. Every drop of rain that fell on the surrounding higher ground ran downhill, into the fort, into the trenches, into the powder horns and cartridge boxes of the British soldiers. Within an hour, the trenches were not trenches. They were streams. The British gunpowder soaked through. The muskets stopped firing. Men tried to clear the touch holes. Men tried to dry the powder against their bodies. It did not work. The rain was too heavy. The mud was too deep. The British rate of fire collapsed. The French, sheltered under the dense canopy of the surrounding forest, kept their powder dry. They kept firing. Inside the fort, men died. 31 dead, 70 wounded. The casualties mounted hour by hour, and the British could not return fire. And then discipline broke. The provision hut at the center of the fort held the Army's stocks, food, ammunition, and by the medical standards of the 18th century, liquor, kept as a medicine, issued to wounded men, rationed by officers. As the afternoon collapsed into chaos, a group of Virginia militiamen broke into the hut. They were terrified. They were freezing. Their officers had lost control. They began to drink. Within an hour, a significant portion of the Virginia regiment was drunk. They were drunk inside their own fort under enemy fire, while their commander tried to organize a defense. Some were too drunk to stand. Some were too drunk to load. Some sat in the flooded trenches and laughed. Washington walked the perimeter. He could see what was happening. He could not stop it. His command was disintegrating in front of him, and he was 22 years old, and he had no idea what to do. Outside the fort in the trees, Coulon de Villiers also had a problem. He did not know, but he suspected that his men were running low on ammunition. His indigenous allies were tiring. The rain that was killing the British powder was also harder on his own warriors than he wanted to admit. He had unconfirmed reports that British reinforcements might be marching from the east. If they arrived while he was still committed in front of a fortified position, he could lose the entire operation. At 8 in the evening, with the light failing and the rain still falling, Coulon de Villiers made the calculation that would change the world. He offered Washington a truce. A French officer walked toward the fort under a white flag. He proposed a parley. He proposed a discussion of surrender terms. Washington was terrified. He did not want the French officer anywhere near the fort. He did not want him to see the flooded trenches. He did not want him to see the drunk soldiers. He did not want him to see that the British position was on the verge of total collapse and could not have held another hour. Washington refused to let the emissary approach. Instead, he sent 2 of his own officers out into the dark and the rain to negotiate. The senior negotiator he chose was a man named Jacob van Braam. And that choice, that one choice, made in a flooded fort in the dark by an exhausted 22-year-old, would change the history of the world. Jacob van Braam was born in Bergen op Zoom, in the Dutch Republic, on April 1, 1729. His native language was Dutch. He had served as a soldier, first in European armies, then in the British Naval Service, where he had fought alongside Lawrence Washington, George Washington's older half-brother, in the disastrous 1741 expedition to Cartagena. He had come back to Virginia with Lawrence Washington. He had attended the same Masonic lodge as the Washington family in Fredericksburg. He was, by the early 1750s, a familiar figure in their world. His exact relationship to the young George Washington has been romanticized in later biographies. Washington Irving's 1855 account portrayed him as Washington's personal fencing instructor, though Mount Vernon's own historians note that the only documented payment Washington ever made to a fencing master was to a different man entirely. What is documented is that Van Braam accompanied Washington on the 1753 mission to deliver Dinwiddie's ultimatum to the French, and that he served as Washington's French interpreter on that mission and again at Fort Necessity. It was a catastrophic appointment. Van Braam did speak some French. He had picked it up through years of mercenary soldiering across Europe, where French was the lingua franca of professional military service. He could carry on a basic conversation. He could understand simple instructions. He could not, in any meaningful sense, translate a legal document. His native language was Dutch. His second language was English, learned imperfectly in Virginia. His French was the French of a soldier, workable in barracks, inadequate in a courtroom. And he was being asked to translate, in the dark, in the rain, by candlelight, a French legal document of the highest diplomatic consequence, into the English of a commander who was exhausted, terrified, and 22 years old. What happened next was the diplomatic disaster that started a world war. Coulon de Villiers handed Van Braam the prepared surrender document. The terms were, in many respects, lenient. The British would be allowed to march out with honors. They would keep their personal possessions. They would surrender the fort, but retain one swivel gun. They would agree to abandon the Ohio Valley for 1 year. They would surrender 2 officers as hostages. But the preamble. The preamble said something else entirely. The preamble said that this entire French military operation was not an act of war between 2 empires. It was, in French legal language, an act of justified retribution. It was a response to a specific crime. The crime was named explicitly. It was called l'assassinat, the assassination, of the French officer Jumonville. The word l'assassinat is not subtle in French. It does not mean the killing. It does not mean the death. It means, specifically and legally, the murder of a person whose status protected them from violence. A diplomat, an envoy, a man under flag of truce. If Washington signed a document containing that word, he was signing a confession. He was confessing that the killing at Jumonville Glen had been a criminal assassination of a diplomatic envoy, not an act of war between belligerents. He was handing France, in writing, the legal grounds to claim that Britain had violated the laws of nations. Van Braam read the document by candlelight. The candle guttered in the wind. The rain dripped through the canvas of the makeshift shelter. The French negotiators waited. The page was wet. The ink was running. He read the word l'assassinat. He did not know what it meant, or he knew what it meant in conversational French, to kill someone. And he did not know what it meant in legal French. He did not know that the word carried the specific connotation of murdering a protected person. He did not know that signing the document was signing a confession. He translated the word into English for Washington as something soft, something neutral. Washington later testified, repeatedly and for the rest of his life, that Van Braam translated l'assassinat as the death of, or the loss of, or the killing of Jumonville. Washington heard those words. He thought they were describing a battlefield fatality. He thought he was signing a document acknowledging that a French officer had died in the previous engagement. He thought he was agreeing to a routine prisoner exchange and a graceful withdrawal. He signed. James Mackay, the British regular officer, signed beneath him. It was nearly midnight on July 3rd, 1754. The rain was still falling. The wounded were still dying. And by the light of a single candle in a flooded ditch in the Pennsylvania wilderness, a 22-year-old colonel had just confessed in writing to the assassination of a French diplomatic envoy. He had no idea what he had done. The French knew. Coulon de Villiers knew exactly what Van Braam had translated and exactly what Washington had signed. He kept the signed document. He folded it carefully. He sent a courier north with it the next morning. By August, the document was in Quebec. By September, it was in Paris. By winter, it was being read aloud in the courts of Europe. France had not started this war. France had been wronged. France had been the victim of an unprovoked assassination committed by British colonial troops in time of nominal peace. France now had the moral and legal authority to wage open war against Britain on a global scale, and every neutral power in Europe was being told the story. The signature was the trigger. The translation was the gun. Washington spent the rest of his life trying to explain what had happened. He insisted, until his death in 1799, that he had never knowingly signed a confession to assassination. He insisted that Van Braam had mistranslated. He insisted that the document he had signed was not the document the French had published. It did not matter. The signature was real. The document was authentic. The war it caused was already burning across 4 continents by the time Washington's denials reached Europe. On the morning of July 4th, 1754, the British garrison marched out of Fort Necessity. It was the only Independence Day in George Washington's life that ended in surrender. The terms of capitulation granted the British what 18th century military protocol called the honors of war. The defeated garrison was allowed to march out of their fort with drums beating and colors flying. They were treated as soldiers, not as prisoners. It was a gesture of respect from one professional army to another. The British did not look professional. They looked like survivors of a catastrophe. The men were soaked through. Many were wounded. A significant number were still drunk from the previous night. The Virginia militia had lost almost all military bearing. The South Carolina regulars, still in their red coats, still in formation, marched with the grim dignity of men who knew they had lost a battle they should not have been asked to fight. They were allowed to keep one swivel gun. They abandoned the other 8. They were allowed to keep their personal possessions and small arms. They were forced to leave the bulk of their supplies, their cannons, their stores of ammunition, and their wounded who could not walk. The capitulation included a guarantee from Coulon de Villiers that his indigenous allies would not attack the retreating column. This guarantee did not survive contact with reality. As the British marched out, indigenous warriors moved into the empty fort. They began plundering the abandoned baggage. They took officers' personal trunks. They took ceremonial items. They took from the personal effects of one Captain Robert Stobo, about whom we will hear a great deal more, a valise containing letters, a jewelry box, and a wagon's worth of imported Madeira wine. Some of the warriors did not stop at plunder. They took prisoners. They seized British soldiers from the column at the edge of the meadow and led them away into the forest. Washington watched it happen. He did not order his men to resist. He had 70 wounded and 31 dead, and a force that could barely walk. He could not afford a general engagement on the trail. He let the prisoners go. The French watched the plundering and did nothing to stop it. Coulon de Villiers had promised to restrain his allies. He had not actually possessed the authority to do so. The indigenous warriors had come for vengeance and for trophies. They were going to have them. When the British column was out of sight, the French moved to complete their work. They smashed the remaining swivel guns. They smashed the iron parts of the remaining wagons. They piled tinder around the wooden palisade. They set Fort Necessity on fire. The fort burned through the afternoon. By evening, it was a black ring of charcoal in the middle of the meadow. Coulon de Villiers and his troops withdrew north toward Fort Duquesne. They took with them 2 British officers as hostages, the men named in Article 7 of the capitulation. The first was Jacob van Bram, the Dutch translator whose mistranslation had given France a casus belli. The second was Robert Stobo, the Scottish merchant whose wine had just been stolen. The British column staggered east. They had 60 miles to march to reach safety at Wills Creek. They had no wagons. They had no food beyond what each man carried. The wounded who could walk were helped by those who could. The wounded who could not walk were carried, or in some cases were left at improvised camps along the trail with a few unwounded comrades who would either save them or bury them. Washington led the column. He was 22 years old. He had just lost the only battle of his life he would ever lose. He had just signed a document he did not understand that would, within months, be used to ignite a global conflagration. He had no way to know that yet. He was thinking only about the next mile, and the next, and how many of his men he was going to be able to march home alive. He marched them home, most of them. The Virginia Regiment had taken close to a quarter of its strength in casualties, but the survivors reached Wills Creek by mid-July. They were fed. They were treated. They were paid. They were sent home to their farms and their families. The war they had begun marched on without them. The 2 officers Washington handed over as hostages were not a random selection. They were the 2 officers who had stood closest to him during the surrender negotiations. They were the 2 officers Coulon de Villiers had specifically wanted. They were Jacob van Bram, the translator, and Robert Stobo, the regiment's engineer. Stobo was 27 years old. He had been born in Glasgow, Scotland, in 1726. He had emigrated to Virginia in his early 20s and made a fortune as a merchant in Petersburg. When Washington called for volunteers in the spring of 1754, Stobo had appeared at the muster ground with a 300-guinea wagon, 10 servants, a cask of fine cheese, and 130 gallons of Madeira wine. He was commissioned as a captain. He was assigned to serve as the regiment's engineer on the strength of his interest in fortifications and his willingness to read books about them. He was, in other words, a wealthy amateur. He should have been a footnote. What he became, instead, was one of the most consequential spies in colonial American history. When the indigenous warriors looted the British baggage train in violation of the capitulation, Stobo lost a great deal of property. He lost the Madeira. He lost the cheese. He lost the jewelry box. And he came to a quiet, private conclusion that would shape the rest of his life. The capitulation, Stobo decided, had been broken. The French had failed to control their allies. The treaty was, in his judgment, null. He was no longer bound by the parole of a hostage. He was not obligated to behave like a gentleman prisoner. He was, in his own mind, free to act. He acted as a spy. The French escorted their 2 hostages back to Fort Duquesne. The fort, when Stobo and Van Braam arrived, was still under active construction. It was the largest French military installation west of the Appalachians. It was the linchpin of French strategy for the entire Ohio Valley. And the French, in a decision they would come to regret bitterly, did not confine their hostages closely. Stobo and Van Braam were allowed to move about the fort. They were quartered in officers' housing. They dined with French officers. They walked the parapets. They watched the gun crews drill. They saw the supply wagons arrive and leave. They counted the men. Stobo had been the regiment's engineer. He understood fortifications. He understood angles of fire, fields of approach, supply routes, weaknesses. And he was, by accident of geography, now living inside the most important French fort in North America. He wrote a report. The report was 815 words long. It described the strength of the garrison. It described the routine of the watch. It described the location of the powder magazine. It described, in detail, the angles at which the fort could be approached and the points at which its walls were thinnest. On the back of the report, he drew a map. The map was extraordinary. It was a precise architectural blueprint of Fort Duquesne. It showed every bastion, every gun emplacement, every wall, every gate. It was the kind of document the British Army would have paid a fortune to obtain through any other means. Stobo produced it from memory and direct observation, working in secret in his quarters on a paper he had managed to keep from the looting. He had a second problem. He had to get the document out. He solved it by recruiting 2 indigenous allies of the French. Their names were Moses and another whose name has not survived clearly in the records. They had reasons of their own to deal with the British. They agreed to carry letters east. They agreed not to read them. The letters and the map left Fort Duquesne in late July of 1754. They reached the British command at Williamsburg within weeks. They were copied. They were distributed. They were, in a decision that would ultimately destroy Stobo, copied carelessly enough that they began to leak. By 1755, rumors of the map had reached the French. By 1756, the British, in a moment of catastrophic professional incompetence, had allowed copies to circulate in European newspapers. The French now knew that one of their hostages had betrayed them. They did not yet know which one. But they suspected, and the suspicion fell most heavily on Stobo. In late 1754, Stobo and Van Braam were transferred from Fort Duquesne to the heart of New France. They were moved by boat down the rivers and east to Quebec City, the great fortified capital of French North America. There, they were quartered comfortably. They were paroled. They were allowed to receive visitors, to dine with French officers, to attend social functions. They were treated, in short, as guests. That changed in July of 1755. In July of 1755, on a sweltering afternoon near the Monongahela River, a British army under Major General Edward Braddock was ambushed and destroyed by a force of French and indigenous fighters. Among the items captured in the wreckage of the British baggage train was a leather case belonging to the slain general. Inside the case were maps, plans, intelligence reports. One of the documents in that case was a copy of Stobo's letter. With Stobo's map of Fort Duquesne, with Stobo's signature, the French had their proof. Stobo and Van Braam were arrested. They were placed under close confinement. In October of 1756, they were both put on trial for their lives before a war council in Montreal, presided over by the Governor-General of New France, the Marquis de Vaudreuil. The trial lasted 19 days. It was conducted in French. Stobo was provided with a French-speaking advocate, but the language barrier left him largely a spectator at his own proceedings. The court heard testimony from French officers who had been at Fort Duquesne during Stobo's captivity. They testified that he had been allowed unusual freedom of movement. They testified that he had asked detailed questions about the fort's construction. They testified, with the help of the captured documents from Braddock's baggage, that he had transmitted detailed intelligence to the enemy in a time of declared truce. Van Braam defended himself by pointing out, accurately, that he had been the translator and had no role in producing the map. His signature appeared nowhere on the smuggled documents. His French was poor enough that the prosecution could not credibly accuse him of sophisticated intelligence work. He had played cards with French officers, he had attended their dinners, and he had committed no overt act of espionage. The court believed him. He was acquitted of the espionage charges. Stobo's defense was more difficult. The evidence against him was, by any honest measure, overwhelming. The map was in his hand. The 815-word report was in his hand. The signature on the cover letter was his. His argument, that the French had broken the capitulation first by failing to restrain their indigenous allies, and that this breach had released him from the obligations of a hostage's parole, was a legal theory that some 18th century jurists might have accepted. The court at Montreal did not. The court found that the obligations of a hostage were absolute, and that nothing the French had failed to do had given Stobo the right to act as a spy. He was found guilty of treason. He was sentenced to death by the guillotine. The verdict was read aloud in French. Stobo, who by this point understood enough French to know what was happening, did not flinch. He bowed to the court. He was led back to his cell. The sentence was sent to Paris for confirmation. It is one of the small ironies of history that the French royal court, distracted by the larger war Stobo had helped to ignite, never got around to confirming the death sentence. The paperwork sat in some Versailles office for years. Stobo was returned to confinement in Quebec. He was not executed. He was instead kept in a comfortable but supervised imprisonment, waiting for an answer from Paris that never came. He spent the next 3 years planning his escape. Stobo's first escape attempt came in 1757. He nearly made it. He was recaptured within days, dragged back to Quebec, placed under closer guard. His second escape attempt came later in 1757. He was recaptured again, this time within hours. The French tightened their watch. They moved him to a more secure location. They cut his contact with the outside world. They assumed they had broken him. They had not. In May of 1759, Stobo organized his third attempt. This one was different. This one had been planned for almost 2 years in whispered conferences with fellow prisoners, in small gestures of accumulated trust, in the slow gathering of supplies and information. Stobo had identified other British prisoners willing to join him. He had identified weak points in the watch. He had identified, crucially, the timing of supply runs along the St. Lawrence River. On a moonless night in May, Stobo and a small group of fellow prisoners slipped over the wall. They moved through the dark streets of Quebec to the river. They had located a birch bark canoe. They took it. They paddled downriver into the night. with 700 miles of hostile territory between them and the nearest British line. The journey was brutal beyond description. They paddled by night and hid by day. They ate what they could find or steal. They avoided French settlements. They avoided indigenous hunting parties. They were soaked, frozen, and starving for most of the journey. On one of the islands in the St. Lawrence, the escapees encountered two indigenous men. Stobo and his companions had reason to believe these men would report their presence to the French. New York Colony had recently posted a bounty of $24 per scalp on certain enemy indigenous warriors. Stobo's group, calculating the bounty against the risk of discovery, killed both men. They took their scalps. They continued downriver. This is a detail history is right to find difficult. It was a violation of the laws of war as those laws were understood, even at the time. It was a murder for money committed by men whose own freedom depended on staying invisible. Stobo never apologized for it. He recorded it in his memoir as a tactical necessity. Whether that judgment was honest or self-serving, the men he killed are owed at least the dignity of being remembered as victims, not as obstacles cleared from a hero's path. The escape continued. Stobo and his companions hijacked a French sailing vessel. They survived an encounter with American privateers who initially mistook them for the enemy. They navigated the lower St. Lawrence by stealth. And in the summer of 1759, after a journey of more than 700 miles, they reached British lines. Stobo was alive, he was free, and he was about to make the most important contribution of his life. The British, in 1759, were preparing the campaign that would end French rule in Canada. Major General James Wolfe was leading an army up the St. Lawrence to attack Quebec City, the same fortified capital where Stobo had spent the last 4 years as a prisoner. Wolfe had a problem. Quebec sat on a high cliff above the river. The walls were thick. The garrison was substantial. A frontal assault would be catastrophic. Wolfe needed a way up the cliff that the French were not watching. Stobo knew Quebec better than almost any officer in the British Army. During his years of imprisonment in the city, he had walked the perimeter many times. He had studied the cliffs above the St. Lawrence with the eye of a man who had once drawn Fort Duquesne from memory. According to Stobo's own later memoirs, he personally identified for Wolfe the lightly defended footpath leading up the cliff face to the plateau called the Plains of Abraham. A path the French had considered too steep to need defending. How much credit Stobo actually deserves for this is one of the small, unresolved questions of the campaign. His memoirs claim he showed Wolfe the path. The contemporary evidence is more complicated. Stobo had escaped Quebec earlier that summer and had been forwarded to Wolfe's staff specifically because of his knowledge of the local terrain. A letter from Lord Rollo at Louisbourg explicitly states that Stobo was being sent to Wolfe to point out avenues to the place. But by the time Wolfe made his final decision about where to land, Stobo had been sent away again with dispatches to General Amherst at Crown Point. He was not at the Plains of Abraham when the battle was fought. Some modern historians credit him as a key informant. Others view his memoirs' claims as self-aggrandizing. The honest reading is that Stobo contributed to Wolfe's intelligence picture, and that he may have specifically identified the path, but that the final decision was Wolfe's, and other British officers also reconnoitered the area. What is certain is what Wolfe did on the night of September 12, 1759. 4,000 British soldiers landed below the cliffs in darkness. They climbed a goat path that the French had not adequately defended. By dawn, they were arrayed on the Plains of Abraham, in formation behind the city's walls. The French marched out to fight them. The battle that followed lasted less than 30 minutes. The French were broken. Both commanders, Wolfe and his French counterpart, the Marquis de Montcalm, were mortally wounded. Quebec fell. The fall of Quebec was the death blow to French colonial rule in North America. Within a year, Montreal would surrender. Within 4 years, the Treaty of Paris would strip France of nearly all of her American possessions. The empire that had killed Jumonville's brother, that had tried to execute Stobo, that had built Fort Duquesne to dominate the Ohio Valley, ceased to exist on the North American continent. And Robert Stobo, the wine-importing merchant from Petersburg, Virginia, whether or not he personally pointed up the cliff, had played a meaningful role in the intelligence that brought it down. He was granted a captain's commission in Amherst's 15th Regiment of Foot. He marched into Montreal as a conquering officer in the very city where he had been condemned to death 3 years earlier. He should have been a hero. He was not. The years of captivity had broken something in him. He drank. He developed violent moods. He suffered from a head wound he had taken in later service in Cuba. He returned to Britain in the 1760s, increasingly haunted by what he had seen and done. On June 19, 1770, in his quarters at the Chatham Barracks in Kent, Robert Stobo placed a pistol to his head and shot himself. He was 43 years old. Jacob van Brom, the Dutch translator, lived a quieter aftermath. After his acquittal, he was eventually exchanged back to British custody. He took a commission in the 60th Regiment of Foot, the Royal American Regiment, and continued in British service. When the American Revolution broke out in '75, Van Brom remained in the British Army, on the opposite side from his former student. He wrote Washington a letter expressing regret that the fortunes of war had placed them on opposite sides. Washington never replied. Van Brom resigned his commission in 1799. He retired to France. He died in Charleville, in the Champagne region, in 1792. He was 63 years old. He had never, in any surviving document, addressed the question of whether he had known, in that flooded ditch in 1754, what the word l'assassinat meant. Perhaps he had not known. Perhaps he had known and had not understood the weight of it. Perhaps he had known exactly and had chosen, for reasons we will never recover, not to translate it accurately. The candle was guttering. The rain was falling. Washington was waiting. We will not have an answer to that question. The man who could have given us one carried it to his grave. The surrender at Fort Necessity had embarrassed Britain. The publication of the capitulation document in Paris had infuriated her. By the autumn of 1754, the British government had concluded that colonial militias were not equal to the task of expelling the French from the Ohio Valley. The British government decided to send professionals. In April of 1755, 2 regiments of the British Regular Army landed at Alexandria, Virginia. They were the 44th and 48th Regiments of Foot, both veteran units. They were commanded by Major General Edward Braddock, a 60-year-old officer of the Coldstream Guards. Braddock had spent 45 years in uniform. He had served in Flanders. He had served in the Mediterranean. He had never, in his entire career, fought in a forest. His orders were direct. He was to march to the forks of the Ohio. He was to capture Fort Duquesne. He was to break French power in the Ohio Valley for good. George Washington, 23 years old, asked to come along. This is one of the small redemptive ironies of the story. Washington could have refused to participate. He could have stayed home, nursed his reputation, waited for the next war. He did not. He volunteered as an unpaid aide to General Braddock, accepting no commission and no rank. Because he believed he owed it to his men and to himself to be present when the British Army finally took Fort Duquesne. He marched with Braddock. He kept his mouth shut about most things and offered respectful advice on the rest. He warned Braddock repeatedly, that European linear tactics would not work in the forest. Braddock listened politely. He did not change his plans. The Braddock expedition was a logistical monster. 2,400 men, heavy siege artillery, 12-pounder field guns, 6-pounder field guns, 8-inch howitzers, 4.5-inch mortars, a wagon train miles long. Braddock intended to cut a 12-foot wide road through the wilderness, all the way from Wills Creek to the forks of the Ohio, capable of carrying his guns to the wall of Fort Duquesne. The road was the problem. It slowed everything. The army moved at the pace of the axe parties, cutting trees ahead of them. By June, Braddock realized he would never reach Fort Duquesne before winter at this rate. He split his force. He took 1,300 picked men forward as a fast-moving column. He left the rest behind, with Colonel Thomas Dunbar to follow as quickly as they could. On July 9, 1755, Braddock's advance column crossed the Monongahela River. They were less than 10 miles from Fort Duquesne. They were forming up to make their final approach to the fort. They were marching in column, in proper British formation, banners flying, drums beating. The forest exploded. The French commander at Fort Duquesne had sent out a mixed force of regulars, Canadian militia, and indigenous warriors to delay the British. The force numbered perhaps 900 men. They had not expected to find the British advancing in the open. When the two forces collided on the trail, the French initially recoiled. Then they recognized the British formation for what it was: a target. The indigenous warriors melted into the trees on either side of the British column. They began firing from cover. They were invisible. They were everywhere. The British advance unit fell back into the main body. The main body became confused. Men began firing in all directions, including at each other. Officers tried to restore order. Officers were the first to die. The French and indigenous fighters had specifically targeted any man on horseback or in an officer's coat. Within minutes, the British command structure was decimated. Captains were dead. Lieutenants were dead. Colonels were dying. Braddock himself had 5 horses shot out from under him in the course of the battle. The 6th horse carried him for some minutes before a musket ball struck him in the chest. He fell. He was carried from the field by a small group of survivors that included Washington. The British force broke. They ran. They ran through the forest in panic, dropping muskets, dropping packs, dropping the wounded. The casualty count was catastrophic. Of the 1,300 men engaged, more than 900 were killed or wounded. The French and indigenous force, by contrast, lost fewer than 50 men. The disaster at the Monongahela was, by some measures, the worst defeat suffered by British arms in the 18th century in North America. It demonstrated, with terrible clarity, what Washington had been trying to tell Braddock. European linear warfare did not work in the American forest. The 18th century military order that Braddock represented, the disciplined volley line, the bayonet charge, the formal field, was helpless against a different kind of war. Washington survived. He had 2 horses shot out from under him. He had 4 musket balls pass through his coat. He was not wounded. He helped carry General Braddock from the field, and he was present when the general died on the evening of July 13th, 4 days after the battle. The survivors of the Braddock expedition retreated east. By a coincidence that history has not forgotten, they camped one night about a mile west of the Great Meadows, within sight of the burned ruins of Fort Necessity. The ground where Washington had surrendered the year before, and the ground where Washington was now burying Braddock, were the same ground. They buried Braddock in the middle of the road his army had cut. They marched the army's wagons over the grave. They erased the spot deliberately, so that pursuing indigenous warriors would not find the body and desecrate it. The grave was lost for decades. It was rediscovered accidentally by road workers in 1804. Braddock's bones were reinterred under a small monument that stands there today, a few miles from where Washington had once written, after a different battle, that there was something charming in the sound of bullets. Washington was 23 years old. He had survived the worst British defeat of the century. He had buried his commander, and he had finally, after 2 campaigns, begun to understand the war he was fighting. The defeat at the Monongahela did not end the war. It began it. The French capitulation document, the one Washington had signed by candlelight, the one containing the word l'assassinat, had been working its way through the courts of Europe for almost 2 years. The text had been translated into French, into German, into Spanish, into Russian. It had been read aloud in royal councils. It had been printed in pamphlets. It had been used by French diplomats to argue that Britain was a rogue power that had violated the laws of nations and could not be trusted to negotiate in good faith. By 1756, the diplomatic ground had shifted enough to permit open war. In May of 1756, Britain formally declared war on France. The European alliances rearranged themselves. The Habsburg Empire allied with France against Prussia. Russia and Sweden joined the anti-Prussian coalition. Britain stood with Prussia. The new alliance system, the diplomatic revolution of 1756, drew every major European power into the coming conflict. The war that followed was, by any measure, the first true world war. In Europe, it became the desperate survival struggle of Prussia. Frederick the Great, the king's soldier whose military genius would define the 18th century, held off 4 enemies at once across the great central plain of Germany. He fought the Austrians in Bohemia. He fought the Russians in Pomerania. He fought the French in the west and the Swedes in the north. He won at Rossbach. He won at Leuthen. He bled his army white at Zorndorf and Kunersdorf. By 1762, his kingdom was on the verge of collapse, his armies reduced to a fraction of their original strength, his treasury empty. He was saved by an accident of dynastic timing. The death of the Russian Empress Elizabeth, whose successor Peter III was a personal admirer of Frederick and immediately took Russia out of the war. The miracle of the House of Brandenburg, the Prussians called it. Without it, Prussia would have ceased to exist as a great power. In India, the war transformed the subcontinent. The British East India Company, under the command of a 32-year-old former clerk named Robert Clive, broke French influence in Bengal at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Clive's victory at Plassey, with 3,000 men against a Bengali force of 50,000, opened the doorway through which the British Empire would eventually flow until it dominated nearly all of South Asia, the subcontinent that would, 2 centuries later, be the largest English-speaking country in the world by population, its borders, its languages of administration, its legal systems, began to be shaped by what happened in those years. The Mughal Empire, already weakening, was now competing with a foreign trading company that had its own army, its own navy, and the backing of the British Crown. The trajectory toward British colonial India ran directly through the 7 Years' War, and the 7 Years' War ran directly through Fort Necessity. In the Caribbean, the Sugar Islands burned. Britain seized Guadeloupe from France in 1759. Britain seized Martinique in 1762. Britain seized Havana from Spain, Spain having entered the war late on the French side. In a brutal siege that killed thousands of British soldiers from yellow fever before the city fell. Britain seized Manila in the Philippines from Spain in the same year, in one of the first major operations to project European naval power into the Western Pacific. At the peace settlement, Britain traded most of these conquests back. She kept Florida, which she traded from Spain in exchange for Havana. She kept Grenada and a few other smaller islands. The Caribbean sugar economy, which by mid-century was the most valuable real estate on Earth on a per-acre basis, was reshaped by the war into something closer to its modern form. In West Africa, Britain took the French slaving station at Senegal. The slave trade itself, the engine of the 18th century Atlantic economy, was reshaped by the war's outcome. Britain emerged from the conflict as the dominant naval power in the Atlantic, which meant Britain dominated the slave trade. The infrastructure of the trade, the ships, the financial instruments, the markets, became overwhelmingly British. The human consequences of this concentration would unfold over the next century. At sea, the Royal Navy fought engagements from the English Channel to the South China Sea. The Battle of Quiberon Bay in 1759 destroyed the French Atlantic Fleet and ended any realistic prospect of a French invasion of Britain. The Battle of Lagos earlier that same year had broken French Mediterranean power. By 1760, the Royal Navy was the unchallenged master of the world's oceans, a status it would hold for the next century and a half. And it was fought with particular savagery in North America. After the disaster at the Monongahela, the French and their indigenous allies were unrestrained. Raiding parties moved freely along the frontier from Pennsylvania to Virginia. Settlements that had felt safe for decades were burned. Civilians were killed or taken captive. The British colonial governments, suddenly without the buffer of the regular army Braddock had brought, scrambled to organize local defense. George Washington, now commanding the Virginia Regiment, spent the next 3 years patrolling a 400-mile frontier with a handful of men, trying to protect settlers from raids he had unintentionally helped to make possible. The British eventually won. It took until 1759, the year of Stobau's escape, the year of Quebec falling, before the strategic balance tipped. It took until 1763, with the Treaty of Paris, before the war formally ended. When the dust settled, the map of North America had been redrawn. France had lost. All of New France, Canada, the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, everything east of the Mississippi, was transferred to British control. The French presence on the North American continent, after a century and a half, was effectively gone. The British Empire stood in 1763 as the unchallenged power in eastern North America. The cost had been astronomical. The British government had borrowed money on a scale never previously attempted. The national debt had nearly doubled. The war had cost, in modern estimates, around 820,000 military deaths worldwide, with civilian casualties from raids, famine, displacement, and disease pushing the total toll into the range of 900,000 to 1,400,000. The British government had to pay for the debt. It looked at its empire and decided that the American colonies, newly secure, newly wealthy, no longer threatened by France, should pay a fair share. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. In 1765, the Stamp Act. In 1767, the Townshend Acts. Each of them, in different ways, taxed the American colonies to pay down the debt the colonies had helped to incur. The American colonists did not see it that way. They saw new taxes, levied without their consent, by a parliament in which they had no representation. They began to resist. The resistance, by 1775, had become a revolution. By 1776, the revolution had a declaration. By 1783, the revolution had won. The man who led the revolution, the commander of the Continental Army, the man whose military genius held a starving force together at Valley Forge and crossed the Delaware on Christmas night and trapped a British army at Yorktown. was a 44-year-old former colonel from Virginia named George Washington. He had begun his military career 22 years earlier by surrendering a fort in a flooded meadow to a Frenchman avenging his brother. He had signed, in that meadow, a document that helped to start a war. The war had ended with the British Empire victorious, deeply in debt, and forced to tax the colonies that won it. The taxation had produced the revolution that Washington now led. The line from Fort Necessity to Yorktown is not a straight one, but it is a line. The surrender in 1754 helped to create the conditions for the revolution in 1775. Washington's failure as a young colonel made possible Washington's success as a middle-aged general. The man who lost a fort in a meadow eventually won a country. History does not usually reward its actors for the consequences they did not intend. Washington could not have known, in 1754, that the document he signed would lead, 22 years later, to the founding of a republic. He was not playing that long a game. No one is. But the consequences happened anyway, and the line connecting them is one of the strangest and most consequential in the history of the modern world. Modern military academies still study the Battle of Fort Necessity. They do not study it because it was tactically brilliant. They study it because every failure in it was a failure of a kind that armies still make. The mistakes have new uniforms and new equipment, but they are the same mistakes. The first lesson is the failure of terrain analysis. Washington built his fort in a depression within musket range of a tree line, with no command of the surrounding high ground. This is not an obscure error. It is the most basic error a defender can make. Modern doctrine still teaches that the defender's first job is to know the ground better than the attacker does, to control sight lines, to control approaches, to control elevation. Washington violated every principle of defensive sighting because he had been trained by books, not by terrain, and the books had been written about a continent he was not fighting on. Counterinsurgency campaigns from the 20th century onward have repeatedly demonstrated the same principle. Forces that arrive in a theater with assumptions formed elsewhere. French paratroopers in Algeria, American advisors in Vietnam, Soviet motor rifle divisions in Afghanistan discover that the terrain does not cooperate with their doctrine. The defender or the insurgent, who knows the ground intimately, can offset enormous disadvantages in numbers and equipment. The expeditionary force that does not understand the ground loses, often catastrophically, even when every other factor favors them. The second lesson is the failure of language. Von Braune's mistranslation of l'assassinat was not an isolated tragedy. It was an extreme example of a problem that recurs in every coalition operation, in every diplomatic negotiation, in every interaction between powers that do not share a common language and a common legal vocabulary. Words carry weight that does not always survive translation. Legal terms have specific meanings that conversational fluency does not capture. A treaty translated by an inadequate interpreter can commit a nation to obligations it does not understand it is undertaking. Modern militaries spend enormous resources on linguists for exactly this reason. The lesson of Fort Necessity is that the cost of getting language wrong in a moment of high diplomatic consequence can be measured in continents and in centuries. The investment in qualified interpreters is, by comparison, trivial. The third lesson is the failure of combined command. Mackay's regulars refused to take orders from Washington because of a paper distinction about royal versus colonial commissions. This is not a problem unique to the 18th century. Modern coalition warfare runs into the same friction whenever forces from different services, different nations, or different commands try to operate together. The American doctrine of unified command, developed painfully through the 20th century, codified after Goldwater-Nichols in 1986, exists because Mackay's problem with Washington has reproduced itself in every modern war. A force that cannot operate under unified command is not a force. It is a collection of forces. The British Army in 1754 had collected itself in the Great Meadows. It had not, in any meaningful sense, become a single command. It paid the price. The fourth lesson is the failure of indigenous engagement. Washington and Dinwiddie had treated Tanacharison as a useful tool, someone to be elevated when convenient, ignored when inconvenient, and never genuinely understood as an actor with his own agenda. Tanacharison saw this clearly. He used the British more skillfully than they used him. He maneuvered Washington into starting a war that Tanacharison wanted, on terms that Tanacharison set, with consequences Tanacharison did not have to live with. When the war turned against the Ohio Iroquois, Tanacharison was already dead, having succumbed to illness in October of 1754, 3 months after Fort Necessity. Modern military operations in foreign theaters routinely depend on local allies. The lesson of Fort Necessity is that those allies have their own politics, their own ambitions, and their own definitions of success. A power that recruits indigenous allies without understanding their goals will, sooner or later, find itself fighting a war it did not intend, in a way it did not plan, for outcomes it did not seek. The fifth lesson is the failure of equipment matching. Washington hauled 9 swivel guns across 600 miles of mountains to a battle where they were useless. He did it because they were what he had. Modern forces routinely make versions of this same mistake, deploying capabilities developed for one theater into another where they cannot achieve their design purpose. The lesson is that equipment must be matched to the operational environment, not selected because it is available, and not retained out of institutional inertia. The sixth lesson, and the hardest one, is the failure of moral preparation. Washington was 22 years old when he marched to the forks of the Ohio. He had read about war. He had not seen war. He did not know what it meant to authorize the killing of a wounded man. He did not know what it meant to allow indigenous allies to scalp the dead. He did not know what it meant to sign a document by candlelight that he had not fully read. He learned all of these things in a single summer, in conditions that gave him no time to think about any of them. The lesson is not that 22 is too young to fight. Plenty of 22-year-olds have fought well. The lesson is that the moral weight of decisions made under fire is enormous, and that no amount of training fully prepares a commander for the moment when those decisions are theirs to make. Washington carried Fort Necessity with him for the rest of his life. He grew, slowly and painfully, into a different kind of commander. The man who refused a third term as president in 1796 was not the same man who had heard in 1754 something charming in the sound of bullets. He had lost too much in between to find anything charming in any of it. This is a quieter truth than the tactical lessons, but it is the one that matters most. Modern militaries can teach terrain analysis. They can drill combined arms coordination. They can train interpreters and refine doctrine. They cannot teach the weight of a signature on a page that will help to start a war in which 1 million people will die. They cannot prepare a young commander for the specific moment when a wounded enemy looks up at him and he has to decide what to do. Those moments arrive, and the men who face them are always less ready than they want to be. The best a military culture can do is to surround young commanders with older ones who have already paid the cost, and who can recognize the moment for what it is, and who can stand close enough to help. Washington did not have that. Braddock did not have it either. The British Army did not yet know what kind of war it was fighting in America, and the men sent to fight it had to learn the lessons on themselves, in blood, in real time. The seventh and final lesson is about consequence itself. Wars do not respect the intentions of their starters. The men who begin a conflict almost never get to choose the war that follows. The skirmish at Jumonville Glen was, in tactical terms, almost nothing. 15 minutes, 13 dead. The siege at Fort Necessity, in tactical terms, was almost nothing. One day, 31 British dead, perhaps 30 French and indigenous casualties. By the scale of even 18th century battles, these were small events. The consequences were not small. The consequences were a global war. The consequences were 1 million dead across 4 continents. The consequences were the end of French North America, the birth of British India, the financial pressure that drove Parliament to tax the colonies, the colonial resistance that produced a revolution, the revolution that produced a republic. The consequences run in a clear line from a candlelit ditch in 1754 to the founding of the United States. They run further than that. They run into our own present. The Anglophone world that emerged from the 7 Years' War is the world we still live in. This is the deepest lesson of Fort Necessity. The most ordinary actions, taken by ordinary men in ordinary circumstances, can produce consequences that reshape the world. The 22-year-old colonel signing a paper in a flooded ditch did not know that he was bending the future. He did not know that French diplomats would carry his signature to every court in Europe. He did not know that the war he was starting would burn for 9 years and kill 1 million people. He did not know that the empire he was helping to create would tax his neighbors and provoke a revolution and make him, in time, the first president of a nation that did not yet exist. He did not know. None of us know. The decisions we make today, in the small, ordinary moments when we are tired and confused and 22 years old in our own ways, will produce consequences we cannot see. That is the burden of being a participant in history rather than a reader of it. Washington carried that burden. He spent the rest of his life trying to deserve it. The Great Meadows is still there. It sits in Fayette County, Pennsylvania, about 60 miles south of Pittsburgh, on land now administered by the National Park Service. A reconstruction of Fort Necessity has been built on the original site, based on archaeology and on the surviving descriptions. It is smaller than visitors expect. It is, in person, exactly what Tanacharison called it. A little thing upon the meadow. The visitor center contains uniforms, weapons, documents. There is a copy of the capitulation Washington signed. The word l'assassinat is visible in the original French text, exactly where it was on the night of July 3rd, 1754. Visitors can stand in front of it. They can read it. They can think, if they choose, about what it must have been like to read it by candlelight, in the rain, with a translator who did not understand what the word meant. The grave of Edward Braddock is a few miles to the west, on the road his men cut and his army was marched over to hide his body. The grave was lost for 50 years. It was found by accident. It is marked now by a small stone monument, easily missed if you do not know to look for it. Jumonville Glen is preserved as well, a small site about 7 miles from the main battlefield. The ravine is still there. The boulders are still there. Visitors can stand in the depression where Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville died, where Tanacharison spoke to him in his own language and then killed him with a tomahawk. The site is quiet. The trees have grown tall around it. It is the kind of place where you can hear birds. Robert Stobow's grave is in England, somewhere in Chatham. The exact location has been lost. He was a suicide in 1770, and suicides in the 18th century were not always buried with full ceremony. His map of Fort Duquesne survives in archives. It is studied occasionally by military historians. Jacob van Brahm's grave is in Champagne, France. It too has been lost. He died in 1792, a year before France went through its own revolution, in a war that traced its way back, by long lines, to the document he had failed to translate. Souraces died of pneumonia in October of 1754, 3 months after Fort Necessity. He never saw the war he started run its full course. He never saw what it did to the Ohio Iroquois, who lost their land and their leverage in the British victory. The half-king is buried in an unmarked location in eastern Pennsylvania. His descendants live today on reservations that exist because the war he helped to start eventually displaced them. George Washington lived until December 14, 1799. He had led a revolution. He had been the first president of the United States. He had refused a crown, refused a third term, and retired peacefully to his estate at Mount Vernon. He died of a throat infection. He was 67 years old. He was buried at Mount Vernon, where his tomb is visited every year by hundreds of thousands of people. Almost none of them know about Fort Necessity. Almost none of them know that the first president of the United States once surrendered his entire army to the French in a flooded meadow in Pennsylvania. Almost none of them know that he signed in that meadow a document that helped to start a global war. Almost none of them know that the line from that flooded meadow to the country they live in is a real line, drawn through real consequences, paid for in real lives. The meadow remembers. The grass grows back every spring. The trenches Washington dug have softened into the earth. The fort has been rebuilt. The visitor center has the document. The summer rain still falls, sometimes, in the same flooding sheets it fell in on July 3rd, 1754. 22 years old, 400 men, a flooded ditch, a candle in the rain, a word he could not read in a language he did not speak, a signature placed beneath it. And from that signature, a war that killed 1 million people, an empire that fell, an empire that rose, a revolution, a republic, a world. Sometimes the most consequential moments in history are not the loud ones. Sometimes they are the quiet ones. A pen scratching on wet paper, a candle going out, a young man, very tired, signing what someone else tells him the words mean. That is how this world began.